I think that includes you, David Scholes, please. And I'm going to call the meeting to order. So, hello, everyone. I think, do folks that are here want to introduce themselves quick to make sure we're not missing anyone?
Where do you want to start?
With you, Anne.
Okay. Ann Cummings, I represent the Vermont Senate.
Thank you. Zoe?
Hi, good morning. I'm Zoe Saunders, Interim Secretary of Education.
Mike?
Mike Leclater, and I'm representing the Vermont Superintendents Association.
Thank you. And Elizabeth?
Elizabeth Jennings, I'm representing VASBO, the Vermont Association of School Business Officials.
Thank you. And I'm Emily Kornheiser. I'm here representing the Vermont House of Representatives. And we are waiting on Craig Bolio, Tax Commissioner, and Nicole
I'm here,
Mace.
Emily.
Oh, hi, Craig.
I will be on camera in sub 10 minutes. I am leaving the National Life Building because I misread the location. So I'm heading back to my office and I'll hop up. No, that's my fault. I'll see you guys in a few minutes, but I'm listening in on the phone.
Okay.
You're welcome to stay at National Life, Craig, if you want.
I was going to say, Craig, I can get you in office, so you can come join me.
All good. I'll be back in my office in a moment.
So we are just waiting on Nicole Mace now, and she said she'll join us shortly. So the agenda, we're going to approve our minutes, hear from the public, and then if we have extra time between the public and 10:30, I'm going to do a preliminary group conversation. So that's an amendment to the agenda. And then we're going to hear from Larry Pikus to tell us a little bit about the new report that he just published for the Joint Fiscal Office. We'll take a quick stretch break. And then we're going to hear from New Solutions, K-12, and APA on behalf of the Agency of Education. And then we're going to have a discussion about sort of our next steps and our recommendations, and then we will adjourn. Any other amendments anyone wants to make? Great. Can I have a motion on approving the meeting minutes?
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor of approving the meeting minutes from October 14th, 2024, wave your hand around.
Aye.
Fantastic. Thanks. I'm going to assume you waved your hand, Craig.
I'm a yes.
Great. Thank you. Don't wave your hand while you're driving, I guess. And with that, thanks everyone. We are going to hear from the public. If you would like to participate in public comment, please raise your virtual hand so that I can see you in a stack. It seems that we have no public comment. If you are in the audience and I have misunderstood, feel free to pipe up. Okay. And I know the full commission has public comment at both sides of their meetings, as well as hosting, what do you call them, listening sessions? The ones that the full commission is doing?
Yeah, public engagement sessions.
Public engagement sessions, thank you. So if folks do have something they want to share, that is a great place for that. Thank you. You're also always welcome to send either the full commission or the committee a email with either short or comprehensive attachments. Thanks. And with that, okay. Discussion. So at our last meeting, we sort of followed up on the brainstorm that we had had at the previous meeting, hearing some policy content on sort of each of the brainstorms we had. We were not able to go deep on any of them, but it was sort of a helpful, I thought, a helpful teaser. And then you all had the full commission meeting that I joined part of to sort of continue that brainstorm. I'm wondering if anyone has sort of any initial thoughts from that, and then I want to sort of show you a structure that I think might be useful for continuing this conversation. But does anyone want to sort of share any thoughts that came from any of those things? Okay. Then, so I took the brainstorm that happened at our meeting and the brainstorm that happened at the full commission meeting and an email from the school board association, I think, along with a few other associations. And I think a fourth, Julia Richter's report on cost containment from last session. And I put those all together, and those lists were like fairly similar. I don't think that will surprise anyone, since many of you have been part of most of those conversations. So those were fairly similar lists, and I took all of those lists and I put them into a chart, and I would like, and then would love to share that chart with you as a framework for us organizing our thoughts a little bit. So
is this the one that was just sent to us in
the one that was just sent to you?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to, I'm going to share my screen. I think I'm going to try to share my screen, which is scary even on Zoom and scarier on Teams somehow. So we're going to see how this goes and to sort of talk you through what the framework is. So give me a minute here. Can you see it?
You can see it. I can't
Yes,
read.
we can.
Okay, so tiny. I'm going to use words too, because I imagine it's tiny for you, because I can just read it and it is on my big screen. Okay, so in the first column, I put the brainstormed idea and clustered them by sort of theme. So things related to tuitioning. Ooh, this one should be green here. Topics related to school size, healthcare costs, special education, state supported schools, facilities. Obviously, some things go in multiple buckets. And then sort of a second table of ideas to reduce property tax rates. And this is adjusting the current revenues, adjusting the structure of the ed fund, and adjusting the funding formula. And then in order to get our heads around sort of what it would actually take to make any of these changes, have a column for the earliest effective date. That would be when, say, the legislature could, in like a best case scenario, pass this. Or if, say, it was something that the Board of Ed would do, the earliest that they might be able to pass it. The soonest date that it would curb any costs or reduce tax rates. Sometimes this might be a 5-year time span until fully realized. Sometimes it might be 1 year. Maybe it's 20 years, who knows? The next column is the fiscal impact when it would be fully realized, if we might be able to get our heads around that for a sense of scale. The policy goal. When I tried this, I got a little bit more specific, but it might be helpful to line it up with the guiding principles that you all agreed to in the full commission, which were equity, quality, and affordability. And then fiscal scale, this gets to sort of like, is the juice worth the squeeze? How much effort might it be to reduce something by a few $1 million versus something that might make a difference for $300 million, you know, that kind of question. But because sometimes a fiscal scale might be small, but that might be dependent on a lot of other things, we have a column for other impacts or dynamics and contingencies and dependencies. So other impacts or dynamics are things like there's no way on God's green earth this might pass, or this, just the others you might put in. And then contingencies, dependencies are policies that would only work really if another policy also passed simultaneously. And so I know there's been a lot of conversation, just as by way of example, to all these tuitioning reforms, fairly small fiscal scale in the grand scheme of things. But if that sort of policy area isn't limited, I think there's a real question about if the school size and class size changes are made, those two things have a really high sort of assumed interaction value. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so you would put contingencies, dependencies there. Or making changes to special education, the contingencies and dependencies there might be federal law. Right. Does the basic framework I'm working with here make sense to folks?
No, I like how you have it laid out. And
Okay.
I think you were off the session by the time we got to the end of our meeting, and Megan started talking a little bit about a context and drafting a report. So I think this would be easy to use.
Yes, good. And I did watch the recording of the meeting afterwards.
Okay, great.
Yeah. So I did this myself as a way of sort of beginning this process. And I think other people also might, I'd love for everyone to sort of do it on their own or try doing it as a group. And I think that would be helpful for us to have some sort of conversation about all this. We're not going to be able to go through the entire table on our own. So I think it's helpful for people to be thinking about it privately, and then we can have sort of a public conversation about it. But there are a few lines where I actually did not understand the brainstorm well enough to dig into. And so I'd love to surface those and see if someone could add more context to them. Does that sound okay?
That sounds great. Yeah, I don't see
Okay.
bake sales on this one. Wasn't that one of the comments?
You don't see what?
Bake sales.
Oh,
I think
yeah,
that was
I left that
a little bit
one
of
off.
sarcastic choice. Yeah.
I did leave that one off. If someone wants to add that back in, they are welcome to.
No, thank you.
My daughter is now in college, but actually, like the resentment I had around the bake sales was fairly high as a parent.
How about raffles? So far, I have bought coffee and raffles to support schools this year.
Yes, if anyone wants to add in any of those things, they're welcome to do that with their own chart. So I have questions about a few of them, and so I would love to ask about those. So row 33, adjusting property revenues to the education fund. I'm wondering if anyone thinks that sort of in the context of the other more specific revenue rows, if that's still necessary, or if anyone wants to add sort of more flesh on that bone. I'm so sorry. That was like a really bad Monday morning idiom there. Anyone?
I don't understand.
Okay, I'm gonna delete that row. Seeing no objections. Okay, moving in a nonlinear fashion here. Row 6, tuition costs to approved providers. how is this different than 4 or 5? Anyone?
Was that
And if
one
you want,
from
like-
was that from the brainstorm, Emily?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, I think that is contained in the other ones. It's kind of a vague statement.
Okay. Seeing no objections, I am deleting that one too. Okay. Going down here, row 30. Nope, I changed my row number, sorry. Diversify revenue sources for the Ed Fund to ensure alignment with national average of state support for school budgets. In my Ways and Means mind, the entire Ed Fund is state funds and state revenue. And so I find that a confusing sentence. But again, that's my Ways and Means brain. I'm curious if anyone else has any thoughts on that one.
I didn't put that one on the list, but I think I can understand the context, which is, I can't remember which association sent the comment, but there's been some comments about how Vermont has a stronger reliance on property tax than other states.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's true or not. It may be true, but I think that that's the context in which it's being said, to say that there should be more revenue sources than property taxes. And I say that without making any value judgment on that.
Okay.
And I know that came up at the full board meeting several times about more general fund transfer or transfer of Ed Fund responsibilities to the general fund.
Okay. So is
Yeah.
that covered by add more revenue or transfer revenue and adds like all these other ones, or should it stay as its own?
Yeah, that's what I was wondering, because like
Policy
even
idea.
the last one in that category is saying go to income-based tax for education. That's kind of diversifying how the revenue comes in, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think the only other element of that comment is to use national standards as a benchmark.
Oh. That is. Thank you. I am typing in front of a lot of people. Okay. Great.
And Russia.
Next. Line 38. I understand we're putting content that may be like 100-page bill into one row on a spreadsheet, and that's an absurd task. But I'm wondering if anyone can tell me what 38 means.
Going by some discussions I've had this weekend, I think it may be referring to the disconnect. You know, I vote my school budget, but because of the equalization formula, I don't have a direct impact. Like wanting to say to Barry, whatever you do to your school budget, everybody else is passed and yours is kind of set no matter what you do.
Okay. So
I mean,
that's
it's
also demonstrated.
That
Okay.
formula, yeah.
So that's already demonstrated in line 40.
see.
I do think 38 and 40 are similar,
Yeah.
Okay.
though 38 is more encompassing. I mean, I do think 38 is getting at the cheapest money in the system is right under the excess spending penalty. The most expensive money in the system is the lower spending districts. And so I think there is a strong argument that the system is sort of a tragedy of the commons, where in aggregate spending will go up more than it maybe otherwise would.
Mm-hmm. Okay, what if I moved this box over here?
Works for me.
Okay,
Yeah, I like that.
great. I was confused about tailoring the excess spending penalty, but Nicole had examples for me, and I'm going to wait for her to be here to talk about that. And then is there anything else in here that people are like, I have no idea what that means? I remember you have your own copy. You don't have to look at my tiny spreadsheet on your screen.
My spreadsheet's just as bad.
Okay. I am going to wrap this sort of intro to this framework up now, and move on from this agenda item. We're going to come back to this chart at the end of our meeting. Sound good?
Sounds great.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Thank you
And
for doing this.
absolutely. Okay. With that, I would love to welcome Dr. Larry Pikus to our meeting. Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate you taking the time. We have about 45 minutes with you, and know that you've recently published, the Joint Fiscal Office recently published a report that you authored, and would love for you to give us an overview of the report, and we'll have a chance to ask questions. I think some of us have read it in depth and some of us might have skimmed it. And just really glad that you're here with us. Again, I know you've done a lot of work in Vermont. Oh, before I go to you, Mike has a question here.
Would you be able to just stop sharing your screen? So we can
Oh
see
God, I'm so
Larry?
sorry. Yes, thank you
Yep,
so
no
much.
problem.
All done sharing my screen. Thank you for asking. Feel free to interrupt me for such things. So Larry, welcome. The floor is yours. We're really glad to have you with us. I don't know if you want to share your screen, but you should be able to do that if you do.
Thank you, all of you. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. I know that the chair of the committee and some of the staff are aware that I returned from 10 days in Brazil with our EDD, one of our EDD programs, late yesterday afternoon, and the trip was fairly intense. And I don't actually have a formal presentation as I might have been able to produce. And we were having a very exciting time visiting schools and universities in Brazil and learning a great deal. Has relatively little to do with Vermont, so I'm shifting gears early in the morning here and trying to hopefully be helpful to you, and of course happy to continue to do so as need be. And thank you. I have had a long and I think very hopefully productive relationship with the state of Vermont. I first started conversations with the legislature shortly after the Brigham decision in the late 1990s, and we've done since that time several studies in Vermont, including one about 10 years ago, fairly extensive adequacy study. The study that we're reporting on today is a more of a, I'm not sure what the right word is, but maybe a 30,000 foot adequacy study. Our model, which I'll describe in a minute, is an evidence-based model which relies on research to try to estimate adequacy. It, generally speaking, in a perfect world, builds from every single school in the state and then sums all that up. That's a fairly extensive and difficult process that takes a fairly long time to do and to reach agreement on what the data are. It's particularly complicated in Vermont because your schools and your districts are both small, and I'm not sure what the right word is, but boundaries aren't always as clear as they might be in terms of district boundaries, and because of supervisory unions and consolidations and things that have gone on over time. We were first contacted by the Joint Fiscal Office sometime during your last legislative session and asked if we could be of help in some way. And what we did is what we call a sort of a state level adequacy study. And at that level, we try to estimate the parameters of our model really using statewide data. So it has some slippages and some challenges. I'll explain how we went about doing it and what we did to get to the estimates we have. It's the second time we've done a study in Vermont where our estimate of adequacy is a little bit lower than the total spending in Vermont, as we estimate it with the pieces that are added on to be included in comparing funding systems with what we do. So with that, and I know that you would like me to leave a fair amount of time for questions, so I'll try to go relatively quickly and then leave questions. What school finance adequacy, I think you're all familiar with the concept. It's really trying to ascertain how much money a state would need to ensure that all children meet the state's education performance standards. There are 4 models that look at this, and we've done our estimates a couple of times. The other model that we think is probably the most important is the professional judgment model. And I know you'll be talking with Justin Silverstein later today. I don't know exactly what work he's doing with you or whether that's part of it, but he obviously can explain how those things, he does those studies, if you're interested, better than I can. And we've partnered with him in other places and are close friends and work together frequently. Our study looks at education research. Says if you were to design a school based on what research suggests are best practices in schools, these are how you would allocate resources. And it includes resources for class sizes, for core programs. It includes resources for struggling students, which we typically use some measure of low-income children. I think we use the free reduced meal accounts in Vermont to reach that. Then we estimate other costs where you have to use dollars to buy books, to buy supplies, those sorts of things. And then also we estimate central office functions. We then basically came up with a large summary that just gave a state total based on the computations we use. We then made we did 2 things. Our model generates weights that you can impute as to the costs for special education and for at-risk or low-income children and for English language learners. So we then computed, if you will, a weighted pupil count, which is the pupils in each district, and then we weighted the counts for those particular categories and estimated a total amount of money that we would estimate per pupil the state would need. Then sum that, and depending on an assumption around how many children participated in after school and summer school programs, came up with a couple of estimates of costs that suggested our model generated between $460 and $460 million less than the comparative current spending. I can go into more detail on that as you ask questions. We also put in a small factor to consider a weight for small schools based on some of the weights we've generated in other places. We think that a large piece of the concern in these differences is the incredibly small size of school districts and schools in Vermont compared to most other states in the United States. That is, your average, the last time we looked, your average school district was around 300 students or less, which is very small. And I know that Burlington, I think, is still the biggest district, and it is 4,000 students is not a huge district in the standards. You have relatively few, you have under 100,000 students in the state in total. So that leads to where our estimate brought us. I think perhaps the best summary, I'm looking at the report itself, but if I go to the executive summary, I can share my screen and show you the executive summary table that gets us there, if that's helpful to you. I'm sorry, I'm a Zoom user. Okay, I see something that says
I know,
share.
it's so hard. It's so hard. I am too.
I will push on the share and we'll get there today.
Thank you.
I'm not sure. I hit the share button and I'm looking for a screen that tells me what to share, and I'm not sure I see that. content for camera, no. Presenter mode, share content. Let's see if that'll include sound. I'm really sorry. I don't know how to actually share this thing that's on my screen.
So for me, when I hit share content, then below presenter mode, I have something that says screen or window.
I see window, yes.
When I share screen, I wound up showing everyone all of my tabs, which if anyone paid attention might have been fun. But window should
I see
likely
window
save
and
you
it
from
says
that.
content from camera. Share a document. Well, let's try that. Oh, a document. With the document and view of your document camera or webcam. That's not going to work. Isn't there a way to just get it from my screen? Let's proceed. I really apologize. Like I said, I live in Zoom and I don't do very well with that. But what we did was we estimated our model, and then we added to it some additional costs for transportation and for special education.
Larry, I wonder if someone else might have the report up on their screen and could share their screen.
And I'm on page 5 of page 133, if somebody can do that. And I truly apologize. I just, I see the share. Let's try this again. Window, content from camera, PowerPoint Live. I just, well, let's see. It says I can browse my computer. Maybe I can find it this way.
Larry, Julia Richter is going to pull up the report and she is in this meeting and she's going to share her screen and you can,
I can just keep talking.
Narrate whatever she's doing.
All right. So
okay.
There we go. Julia, thank you very much. So why don't you go to page 5 of page 133. It's the summary table in the executive summary. Just scroll down a little more. There's that's the table right there. Thank you, Julia. So what we did was we estimated our model. We added to it the additional parts of the education fund that we thought weren't included in our estimates, but are part of the computations that made sense. And then we estimated the model 2 ways. One of the things we do in the evidence-based model is we assume that the eligible children for after school programs and for extended day programs and summer school, half of the eligible children attend. And the Joint Fiscal Office asked us to also estimate the model if 100% of the students attended. And so those are the range of our estimates. So our estimate of the total cost of the compared to the education fund payment that we estimated was comparable, we came to that number is 1.7 billion, and our estimate was between 1.248 billion and 1.310 billion. So it's about, as I said, mentioned, a $400 to $462 million difference, and then the numbers below represent the per pupil differences. That's where we estimate the amount that Vermont spends above what our model estimates. There is somewhat below where we are on page 5, a highlighted thing in yellow that points out that we would anticipate that if we actually did this on a school by school basis and spent some time working closely with people in Vermont to get a better feel for small schools, our estimate would probably increase somewhat. I'm hard pressed to know exactly how much we've made estimates of this in Wyoming, which at first blush really isn't particularly a comparative state to Vermont, but actually sort of is. It has about the same number of children but with fewer districts, but lots of small schools. So we've worked on estimating what those costs would be in places like that. And my best guess is that the costs of our estimate would go up somewhat if we were able to do that. But that would take us more time than we had during the legislative session, and probably more resources than were available at the time. And we'd be happy to obviously talk with you further about that if you thought it helpful. But I don't know, because I know you have several other studies going on at the present time that may address things in a better or different way. perhaps what's best, given that you had 45 minutes and I want to use your time efficiently, I would be happy, Madam Chair, to answer questions rather than attempt to go through a long, as a professor, I'm often accustomed to speaking in 50-minute bursts, which would have used up all your time. So I prefer to answer your questions and try to keep my answers short and make that work. And I had lots of lectures in Brazil, so I don't need 50 minutes for anything right now.
Thank you. And I imagine you are feeling a little wild right now. So thanks for joining us. There's a table like somewhere in the 80s about your assumptions.
Yes. I will go find that as well. Julia will have a contest to see who gets there first.
And maybe I'm remembering the wrong page number, but I'd love to just go a little deeper on sort of you talking through some of the assumptions that you're working from.
Of course.
About sort of what's included, what's not included, and how you came to those numbers. And I will find that page number myself.
I think it's further than the 80s because I'm still looking at ELL in the 80s.
Okay.
I'm assuming it's in chapter 4. One, salaries.
So while I look for the page number I'm asking about, I think my question for you is there's sort of a difference between the way schools operate in Vermont, not just in terms of class size, but in terms of a lot of other aspects of educational delivery that's different between your ideal model, between the model that you're modeling and the way we operate. And I wondered if you could talk through some of the pedagogical differences that might be separate from the structural differences.
So I'm not sure. Is this the table you were asking about? The table that starts?
It is. Thank you.
Oh, okay. It's up. It's much earlier in the study. It's in chapter 3. I apologize. I was starting to realize that may be what you wanted, but I think that the main difference is, and this is something that is, I don't want to use the word unique because it should never be modified, but is probably unique in Vermont in that your class sizes typically are substantially smaller than our model calls for. And in our model, in our core model, we recommend class sizes of 15 in grades K through 3 and 25 in the grades above that. And recall that our method relies on the research on issues pertaining to schools and their performance. And we read the evidence to suggest that those class sizes provide small enough classes to be pedagogically strong and at the same time give teachers an adequate time to work with individual students as they need to. Class sizes are smaller in Vermont. And if we have in the model, change them to numbers like 12 in the K through 3 and 20 in high schools, and obviously the cost of our estimates go up. I think the question that you would want to resolve is, do you want to rely on current practice in Vermont, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, or sort of the model that we've developed, that we've used in a number of the states to estimate a cost within the parameters of what we think research suggests would work. So our general position is this is, a model that should provide the resources for an adequate education. And as I've said in every state I've ever gone to, I'm never going to stand up in front of a committee and say you shouldn't spend more money if you choose to do so. I've never thought that was a bad thing. I see our adequacy estimate as a floor. And if states choose to allocate more resources to children in schools, I don't think that's bad. But in terms of a debate as to what schools would need or what we think would be adequate resources, we believe that these levels of resources would suffice. The thing to remember is, in addition to these core class sizes, which are always the target of the conversation, there is a very rich set of additional resources that go to children in schools. What might help, Julia, is if you share I'm not sure. Oh, you are sharing the EB model. I'm sorry. I'm looking at your screen. Of those. Okay, right there. That's perfect. So if you look at the bottom kind of row where it says staffing for core programs, that gives us all of the teachers in the model. But recall that after we allocate 15 to 1 or 25 to 1, we add an additional number of teachers for electives and other service, for electives essentially, at 20% in an elementary or a middle school, and at 33% in a high school. So already we're getting closer to your numbers. Although, and so then the question would be, do schools in Vermont do similar things, or when we look at numbers like 12 and 20, is that already baked into that ratio? So you'd want to ask that question. We then have in each school, at least at at each school, we have a tutor, a minimum of 1 tutor, and a minimum of a counselor, and then we have coaches at a rate of 1 for every 200 students. So there are a lot of other supports for children in the core resources. We also support full day kindergarten, and we have the model includes, although I don't think it was estimated here, a pre-K model, which is also 15 to 1, but also adds an aid, which we don't have aids in the rest of the model. Our reading of the research suggests they're not effective in improving student outcomes. Teachers will, of course, tell you that they also need that help just to work with children and do a lot of other kinds of work. We don't have it included in our model. The next row up provides additional resources, the dollar per pupil resources. So perhaps what's better is to jump to sort of that top row with resources for struggling students. And there are a very rich mix of additional resources in schools where there are children who have additional needs. And again, we have a model for special education, and the resources that we've estimated that are needed for special education. We've worked closely with Nate Levinson of K-12 Solutions. I never remember the order in which the name of his firm goes, but we've worked with Nate for a long time. And he has indicated to us on multiple occasions that he sees our allocation of resources as exactly aligned with his estimates of what the resources are needed for special education. And then we believe for children with severe and profound disabilities, which is about 2% of the children in the state, that we should be paid for just directly by the state, so that the location of where a child lives doesn't affect a district's finances directly. But he's been aligned with us with that. I hope when he testifies before you today, he'll confirm that. You can certainly, I think he will. In another place we've been working, he's so indicated. And when we built our detailed model in 2015, we had run those estimates past him at that time. So I think we're lined up with that. We have a rich estimate, a rich number of tutors and pupil support personnel based on the number of again, it's a proxy for children's needs. It's not saying the money can only be used for those children, but it's a proxy for an estimate of how many more staff are needed to help children who potentially are struggling in school. So there's resources that those sources are based on the low income children, whatever the measure in the state is, and the English language learners. There's then pupil support for money for extended day and summer school, as I indicated. One thing that tends to not get caught up in this model is welcome centers. And again, our argument is welcome centers are a temporary thing where there's suddenly a very large influx of children, typically from one area of the world, who need a lot of help for a short period of time, and that influx doesn't continue. And like the children with severe and profound disabilities, we suggest that the state fund those for some period of time, and then that funding goes away as those children are integrated into the school district based on whatever other needs they may have and whatever resources they would generate. And then we've used in the sort of upper right-hand corner, we used your data on salaries and health insurance costs and benefits to generate the total cost of the model. And as Julia will agree, I'm sure we spent a lot of time trying to work out what those numbers were and translating your data into our aggregates to get to that point. I'll stop there.
And then the other place I've gotten a lot of questions is on page 103.
Okay.
We've had a lot of conversations. One of the funny things that I'm sure you're very familiar with is that we don't really have local costs and state costs and district costs. We just have state costs. And that creates all kinds of funny behaviors because different people, I think of that differently. And so I'm curious, and so we've had a lot of conversations about like moving things from local budgets to the ed fund or moving things out of the ed fund into the general fund and all of that. And so I'm curious about sort of how you would describe this chart and tell us about how it shaped your research and your findings.
It just disappeared, but I want to confirm we're looking at table 4.3 in the report. Okay. I don't want to go talking about the wrong table here. So the first line of that table is the estimated adequate costs that we generated through our state level model, and the 50% and 100% refers to the participation rate of ELL and low income students in extended day and summer school programs. So that's what the difference in those costs are. One assumes half of them participate, one assumes 100% will participate. We then added money that was in the education fund for special education that, after conversations with state officials, we felt probably are resources that are spent that make sense but weren't estimated in our model. The same with transportation. Those were the state and district share in some of those costs, and so we added those back in to be sure you had those. We had those to compensate for those costs, and then that gives us our total estimated adequate costs. And we have the Vermont total education fund payment, and then the difference simply boils down to, if you will, I believe it's line 5 minus line 4. And it suggests that our model estimates a lower total than the current aggregate total of what we think are as close as we can get to apples and apples. Your system has always been challenging for us to do estimates with. I believe that it is for the staff in the state as well on many levels with the complexities that exist. But at one point when we tried to do some work around supervisory unions, issues around tuition to other school districts and to private schools and transportation boundaries and all sorts of things, hugely complicated when you got down to some of the details. Obviously, the idea is to do the best you can for children, and so we wouldn't question the choices that people in school districts make without more knowledge of why they make those decisions. But that's what led to the additions in lines 2 and 3 to try to make sure that we might have Gala apples and Fiji apples instead of just apples. But our goal here is to be as close to apples in what our estimate is and what the relevant spending categories are for schools, PK through 12 schools, or I guess K-12 through schools here in Vermont.
We love an apple simile here in Vermont. Thank you. I want to take a big step back and then have other people ask questions if you have them, if other folks have them. What should we be doing with all of this? Like, what do you think are the actual implications for our policy making of this very long, very complex report?
So when I'm sure it was Catherine Benham who first called me and indicated that, you had some you had a lot of election defeats on annual tax budgets for school districts, and that property taxes appeared to have be substantially increasing. My sense is that Vermont, I'm kind of of the view that school finance systems really aren't unique. That is, state school finance systems are basically all the same, and then it's just the historical antecedents of policy and law and things and tax systems that make changes that are the complicated part. I would make that exception that I think Vermont system is unique. You look at things, you've done things differently. Your approach to how they're done are different. And I recall even having conversations in the past as to whether your property tax system is a property tax or an income tax lurking in the property taxes close. I'm not sure how to resolve that conversation, but I've enjoyed those conversations. They're intellectually very fun. The challenge is that you have a great deal of local control over spending levels that then in some ways lead to the state needing to support that, or a system of property taxes that just raise to do that. With, as I recall from our, I think our 2012 study, there are still probably some individuals in the state who can vote to raise their property tax rate and not pay any more money between the cap and the circuit breaker. And I gather since the circuit breaker levels haven't changed, the number of people or households where that happens is declining. So there's just a lot of issues that surround all those sorts of things. You've made some progress in finding ways to, and I hate to use the C word, consolidate, but at least integrate school districts together in some ways and schools together in some ways. And I think that the first level, and this study implies it's possible, I think more than anything else, to consolidate at least the allocation of resources where some economies of scale can be found without changing some of the traditions of Vermont in terms of local schools and local communities and the things that I know you hold valuable. But there are probably places where there are ways to consolidate schools in ways that they don't change that a great deal and can save a fair amount of resources. And those challenges are found on a one-to-one basis and then require, I mean, I think those are the choices of the citizens of Vermont. And so the choice becomes, how much are we prepared to spend on our children, and how much do we want to reduce or slow down the increases in spending in the future? And I think what this report gives you, which is what I think the core of your question was, is a research-based estimate at a very high state level that suggests there is room potentially to identify some savings in a long term. I don't think you could just reduce spending in Vermont by $400 million next year and not have an immense amount of pain in a lot of places. But it provides some guidance as to how to think about the use of resources and how one might move forward to perhaps reduce spending, but perhaps slow down increases in spending, which I think is often the way to do it, because obviously school costs are an annual cost that should never go away.
And then in reading the report, so absent from the headlines about the report, but in the report quite clearly is ideas around that your model does result in an increase in quality and has pedagogical implications. And I would love for you to talk about that a little more. I know you're usually working more in sort of an underfunded state context. And I've seen sort of critiques of your work that are more about sort of its inflationary impacts rather than cost containment impacts. But I'd love for you to go a little deeper on that.
Sure. So you're correct that Vermont is the only state we've ever estimated our model. We've done it twice now. That comes up higher than what where our estimate is lower than what the state currently spends. It hits the mark pretty closely in Vermont in Wyoming, because for 20 years we've estimated the model, and based on their interpretation of the court's ruling, they appropriate that amount of money. But that's a little bit different. Most states, we suggest they need more and work with them on a pathway forward. The evidence-based model, and I perhaps should have been more clear when I started, and I apologize, is based on our interpretation and our reading of what's now between Alan's been working in this field for Alan Odden for close to 50 years, and me for in the vicinity of 45 years. And we spent a lot of time trying to read the research on programs that are successful and that work in schools, and the standards or the elements of successful schools. Those are outlined in chapter 2 of our report. We have the 10 characteristics of effective schools. And then we look at the research about how classes would operate, how programs would operate to provide those high quality services to children. and then estimate those costs. One thing that we typically do in a larger study that has more time is we conduct evidence-based professional judgment panels. And I always call them evidence-based professional judgment because the professional judgment model is similar, but it starts with talking to educational professionals and asking them what they think a school should look like and costing that out. What we do is we say, here's what we think a school should look like. And then we ask professionals in each state, education professionals, what they think. And the model has changed and ebbed and flowed over time in response to the what we learn from the people we talk with in each state. They're fairly consistent, and the things we hear are similar. And then over time, things have changed. So you'll see things like from 25 years ago, there are now far fewer support services for children. That was something that was growing pre-pandemic. Since the pandemic, that has been even more so the case, and the need for mental health care and counseling and services, both for children and their families. So it continued to ebb and flow and change to try to meet the growing changes in schools and in society generally. And then we estimate what that would cost and then bring it to a state. And then each state's political economy is different. And each state then makes different choices about what they are able to do and what they're not able to do, and over time. Wyoming is a state where we've had a long-term relationship, and they've generally appropriated what we suggest. Their test scores were generally pretty high when we started this. I don't know that they've grown a whole lot since then. We had a 20-year relationship with the state of Arkansas, and they dramatically improved test scores, particularly in the early years. If any of you were watching the election returns in 2022 when Governor Huckabee accepted her and called for victory, first thing she said is, we're going to get rid of our terrible school funding system. My wife looked at me and said, how do I feel? I said, well, 20 years is a pretty good run, and hopefully they'll be successful in making schools better. So, these, as you know, all school finance finally boils down to some sort of political decisions about, are our children learning, and do we have the resources to do this? And of course, once we've developed what the resources should cost, it still requires strong teaching, strong principal leadership, and strong district leadership to make sure that the things that we know work in schools, and I tend not to use California examples, so excuse me when I do, but the superintendent of LA Unified, which looks nothing like Vermont, has said over and over, we know what we need to do to help children learn. The issue is, how do we implement those across this huge, crazy district? All right. So the question in Vermont is, how do we implement what we know what to do across a much smaller and I think less diverse state, but a state that has many differences from the northeast corner to the southwest parts of the state. There are differences, and you have to find ways to work with those as well. Did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you. That was really
okay.
Helpful. Mike, and then Elizabeth. And there's a one somewhere that Nicole. Sorry. Nicole, then Mike, then Elizabeth. Oh my goodness, Teams is so hard.
That's okay. I snuck in to this meeting, so apologies for being late this morning. I was double booked. Hi, Larry. Thanks for joining us today as we start to unpack all this complexity. I am on the school board in Winooski, Vermont, which is the most diverse, I think, community, 1.4 square miles in New England, and serves the greatest proportion of English language learners. So I took note of your recommendation, which I believe represents an 82% reduction in the amount of resources under our current, very recently adopted weights for English language learners. And I wondered, speaking to the uniqueness of Vermont, Winooski in particular, as a refugee resettlement community, we don't have a sort of monolithic English language learner population. I think we have up to 26 languages spoken in our district. Many students come without having had a written language as part of their language of their native language. And so I know there's been other studies, one most recently, January of 2024, looking at the Vermont specific context in terms of the needs of English language learners. I'm just wondering if you can speak to how the research that you pulled from may or may not compare to the reality that we face in serving a very complex population in Winooski in particular, but in growing communities around the state.
Okay, I think, thank you, and I think it's a really important and good question. And is the researcher referred to the weights that you've now implemented in the study that Tammy Colby and Bruce Baker did, or is there another study?
Correct, and then study. Okay. I think Tammy did a supplemental study for the legislature that was released in January. That affirmed those initial weights that have been adopted. And so again, there's a pretty significant disconnect between those two, and I'm hoping to understand that a little bit better.
No question that there's something of a disconnect. There are, in my mind, kind of two things that lead to that, and one's more subjective, so I'll talk about that later if that's okay. But initially, the large differences, as I understand Bruce and Tammy's report, and by way of a disclaimer, they're both good friends of mine. So we talk all the time, and it's a school finance is a small community, and so we all know each other and work together as we can. They generated estimated costs of those weights and applied them to a system that exists. When we look at our model, what we recall that we provide additional resources for all low-income English language learners, for all low-income children, and in addition, any English language learners who don't qualify for your low-income measure, which is usually a relatively small proportion of the English language learners. I don't know about the specific demographics of Winooski, but that's a fairly good generalization. But the model has, in addition to those additional resources, it has a great deal of resources embedded in the base model to help students and school leaders identify and serve children with those needs all the way through. And as the models more and more suggest children should be in the regular classroom, a lot of those resources go to the regular classroom. They also include more coaches and more individuals who can help teachers address and help children who come with whatever those the needs that they may have are. So our weights, as a result, when we add the additional resources based on the counts of the children I just indicated we identified, are typically as high or often higher than the weights that are used in almost all other states. And in fact, most other states, the weight is often something that someone says, well, this seems about right, and that's what we can afford, so we'll do it. I think the advantage of the way we do it, and the advantage of the way that Tammy and Bruce do it, is that we try to really estimate what are the right programs and what do these children need. Okay, so we think that there are, across the entire funding system and model, enough resources to meet the needs of English language learners. Now, if your problem is one of all of a sudden 25 children or 25 families, so probably more than 25 children, arrive within 2 years in your district from, say, the same part of the world, then there's really a whole different impact. And like we think about in children with severe disabilities in special ed, that requires something different. Something unique happened in your community for a short period of time, and eventually, if the flow slows down or stops, you're able to catch up and move those children to a more regular program. But we think that the state ought to fund that at the time it happens, because honestly, and I know state and local monies are all sort of the same, but they're not all the same. If you vote an additional property tax based on your wealth and everybody contributes and whatnot, that should be a separate or a fund that clearly are resources from the state that pay those costs. Because if they'd move 5 miles or 10 miles, or you said your district's 1.4 square miles, so they don't have to move 5 miles. They probably don't live in your district anymore. They move to the next town over. And my knowledge of geography is not enough of Vermont's not enough to tell you what community that might be. So I apologize. So we think that that's the case. And then once those children are more integrated into the school system, these should be adequate resources. The subjective point that I would make, and this is with all due respect to my colleagues, Bruce Baker has always estimated weights for children who have these additional needs much higher than anybody else in the literature. So his weights are always high. That doesn't make them wrong. It doesn't make them right. It makes them high. And so, and I think may have testified before some version of this committee a year or two ago about the fact that tends to be the case, and that their weights weren't surprising to me. And so that's when you're sitting where you are, those weights look really good because you need the resources. And we just think there's a different way to do that, and that generally speaking, our model has enough resources to really enable the district to manage the needs of those children. We think that's what the research supports. Sort of half an answer in terms of the problems you faced, right?
Larry, you also mentioned a welcome center in passing.
Yes.
Is that sort of imagined to be from like a totally different pot of money?
Yes, that's not embedded in this because it's the sort of thing that we think is a temporary thing. Again, a welcome center, the obvious thing is a whole group of students have suddenly arrived at once, and it's kind of an overwhelming thing to a school district anywhere. And so how do you ensure that these children and their families get the support that they need to become part of the community and begin their journey through the education system in your community? And so welcome centers have been a powerful tool to start that, to help assess children's needs, to help locate them where they are, to provide additional tutoring services and whatnot, hopefully in their language if possible. Sometimes that's hard too, but to get them integrated into the school system. And often the welcome centers need to provide additional services. Often people who come to the United States need help with things far beyond just education. There may be housing needs, finding food, just finding jobs, all those sorts of things. And a welcome center can be something that's far broader than just children, although many welcome centers and school districts really focus just on the children. But again, if you're going to help a child really succeed in school and they're hungry all the time, or there's other challenges that their family faces in just staying warm at night or whatever, all of those things need to be considered. And it's helpful if that's, and it's like I said, it's not random where they land, but from the perspective of looking at data at a state, it's, you just don't know if they're in the next community or the next district. They're the ones who have the challenge that Winooski faces right now. So it feels that that should be a state challenge rather than a local district challenge. And again, I know it gets mixed up in Vermont a little bit.
Mike and then Elizabeth.
Yes.
Thanks, and thanks, Larry, for your work. I've enjoyed reading your report. I have a question on your conclusion. So if you could move to the last page, like the last two paragraphs.
Okay.
And you talk a little bit about the context. Vermont's current structure with many small schools and school districts likely results in higher costs that are not fully addressed in this analysis. In addition to its many small schools and complex governance, Vermont also maintains an extensive and complex system of tuition payments for secondary education and for private schools. So is it correct to assume that your model is built on a prototypical this prototypical model, and that any savings that are assumed would not take into account our smaller schools, our tuitioning model? And if you could just talk about that a little bit.
So in this model at the state level, we've made some adjustments. There's a table further up in the report that shows how we weighted pupils, and we did add weights for schools in a couple of 2 or 3, I think it was 3 size categories with enrollments that added an additional weight because of the diseconomies of scale. They're smaller; those weights are smaller than some might think are appropriate, and they were generated based on I think our data from earlier studies in Vermont. The idea being that there are diseconomies. If we were to really try to get at that question directly, I think what I would recommend is we would conduct some kind of professional judgment panels, or at least one or two, with representatives from the very smallest districts. And again, I'm hard pressed to know what that means, because in many cases, that's virtually every district in Vermont. Yeah, okay, so it's a statewide professional judgment panel to understand those problems, and that's okay too. We've learned how to do those very efficiently through Zoom in other states. So it becomes less of a challenge than having to be in Vermont and having a specific day. We can do many more shorter periods of time, and people can come from all across the state. And again, that's less of a challenge in Vermont than it is in some bigger states, but it's still, getting across the state can be hard and for people's schedule. So we spend time working with folks, but we would design some work around what are the special costs of size, and try to understand what those needs are. As an example, we're working with APA in Colorado right now, and we did professional judgment panels there. We have for 20 years really held tight that you don't need an assistant principal until a school is substantially over 400 students. Okay, which would pretty much eliminate assistant principals in Vermont. This is at the elementary school level, and in Colorado they pushed back very hard, and I think we've reviewed our thinking. I'm of the view that you need assistant principals till you've got proof that all the other resources really will be such that you don't need that assistant principal to help run the school. But the concept of investment in a position and then taking it away is trickier in public schools or in public government generally. So I think our model's been modified slightly to provide more administrative resources. I'm willing to bet if we had those kind of meetings in Vermont, we would end up at the same place. So there's some. This represents our reading of the literature and our thinking of how we built this model, and the best we can do with our knowledge of Vermont, because we've had the good fortune of being able to work with you for so many years. But to really get at those challenges, we'd really want to come in and visit with you and talk about what those mean. Again, if APA is doing something similar and they're estimating those kinds of costs, we'd probably be happy to figure out what those mean and at least use those as a starting place rather than duplicate their work. Yeah, like I said, I've known Justin for probably 25 years, whenever he started at APA. So we obviously respect each other and work together. I just don't know exactly the nature of his work with you. And I know my hard ending time disappeared when he's the one who's going to be on your meeting instead of my phone call with him at noon your time. So, and that was really nice for me. I'm still trying to dig out from what just happened to me in the last 10 days. So, and unlearn any Portuguese I might have picked up over the course of 10 days.
So it's safe to assume that they're not included in the model, but if you would want to look at that and look at larger schools, you'd also have to look at construction costs, which is another factor too that we haven't talked about, and how that would impact that model. Have you done any study with factoring in those capital costs?
We have not factored in the capital costs, and I would say we have modestly looked at the diseconomies of scale in the model that we presented to you. It's on the table that has the weights, but it's a very modest assumption of what those costs are. I'd have to read the document more carefully before I give you the answer, but we added about 3,129 students to the whole model to accommodate those costs, which I'm sure I could generate a unanimous vote that was an inadequate amount by the educators in the state of Vermont. Okay, and it may be. So I don't want to suggest that's the hardcore number, but I think it's a good estimate to start to see that exists. So but yeah, Vermont presents its own set of important things to consider in doing a very detailed analysis of the costs. And the challenge always, if I could just add, I started to say it at one point, and then I think we went off in a little bit different direction, is that we estimate what adequacy would be based on our reading of the literature. And we are very reluctant, without being able to come up with a good research or evidence-based rationale, to say that just because that's current practice, that's what's adequate. Okay, I mean that's what leads to us generating a report that says our estimate's lower than what you spend. And so that's the tension, if you will. And
Right.
it's just the reverse of the tension that's showed up in the other 30 states we've done this in. So
No, I appreciate that. This is my second superintendency. I spent my previous career over 30 years in a system that had 5,400 kids in a more suburban area, and meeting the kind of the prototypical school system that you described. So I understand the differences between the two and kind of the challenges that we face in Vermont.
okay, it's always good to talk with the superintendent. USC. My day job, I'm a professor at USC, and we have as large ed leadership program I think as any place in the country, and
Right.
I know lots of school superintendents, so that's where I get most of my information when I need to know how things really work in schools. So I talk to my students, to my former students.
Thanks, Larry.
Thank you.
Elizabeth and then Zoe, and then I think we're going to wrap up.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth. I'm actually a director of finance and operations for a school district here in Vermont, and I'm representing our business officials group. I just have a question in regards to special education identification as it compares from this report. Is there a certain percentage that was used in this report? And how does that compare to Vermont's actual identification for special education students?
So we assume that 10% of children in the state have mild and moderate disabilities for special education. And then there's additional 2% that would have more severe disabilities. And those costs are not estimated here. Rather than try to give you a lot of numbers, do a lot of things, I would ask that question again of, I know you're talking to somebody from K-12 Solutions. I'm assuming it's Nate. And whatever answer Nate gives you, that's the way we'd go. We've had a back and forth in email and texts in the last 2 weeks, and we're quite well aligned in how that count would work. Now that's been mostly around our work in Colorado, where they're part of our team, but I think we would feel the same way here. And so, and he came up with some rules of thumb based on our weights and how those work, and it in his mind it all seemed to fit and work. Okay. And I know Nate has worked in Vermont for many years, because when he was working in Vermont when we were there in 2015, and I see that he's back and engaged with you as well. So I guess I would, rather than try to give you a really detailed answer, I would say what Nate says is I'm 100% sure I'd agree with.
Okay.
Is that okay?
I was just thinking that
I'd rather
I
not
think
cause
that
a
Vermont's
problem
might
I
be a
don't need to
little
cause
higher,
here.
but okay.
Yeah, and actually, well, as an anecdote, which is not a good way to do data, but an interesting anecdote, was when we did professional judgment panels in our previous study. I went to a school that we were in a group half an hour north of Burlington. I don't remember exactly where we were. I was talking to a school principal when I said, our number would be 12% of the children across things if you take the 10% and the 2%. She says, well, that's not going to work. My identification rate's 25%. Okay. And then I said, okay, here are the resources that we would provide your school directly to meet special ed needs. And she said, that'd be enough. Okay. So one of the issues here is she was identifying children differently than perhaps the literature says, or perhaps we would identify, but she was completely satisfied with the level of resources to meet the needs of the children she thought needed that additional help. So one of the challenges here is the backside of that problem is not just the count, but also what you're doing and how you're doing it. Now, I don't remember the answer, if I even thought to ask it at the time. How many of that 25% actually had IEPs, which completely constrain your flexibility in terms of what you spend as well. If the IEP says you need to do this, you pretty well have to do that, and then that changes things. So I understand that my anecdote is only half useful, but it was interesting, and it shows that there is subjectivity in identifying and servicing the needs of children who are identified as having disabilities. And once an IEP is designed, that obviously changes things. And
Okay.
There's a whole debate of how aggressive you are about debating what services and what those costs are too, which I don't think we want to get into today. But I know I'm aware it exists.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Larry. I'm Zoe Saunders, Interim Secretary of Education. Thank you for being here, and thank you for putting together the report. The agency is actually contracted with APA New Solutions K-12, so I know you all have worked really closely together, and think that's helpful as we all coordinate and really thinking through concretely what are some strategies that will work in Vermont. One of the things I noted in your report as you were talking about adequacy is just making clear that when putting together an adequacy model, there are certain assumptions that are built in around scale and quality, right? And I think that's important as we engage further in these conversations and think about what this might look like within the Vermont context and what other variables may need to be considered. But one of the things I was just hoping you could reflect on, I know you've conducted a number of comprehensive studies focusing on Vermont's education system, I think back to 2012, if not before then, and just wondering on what you've noted have been kind of the biggest changes for our education system and what you see to be the biggest challenges that we're facing and how that's changed over time that you've been studying the Vermont landscape.
Thank you. That's a challenging question because I'm going to make an assumption that you're more interested in both what's gone on pedagogically as well as what's gone on financially. And I feel far more qualified to speak to the finance part of it than the pedagogical part in terms of what the work I've done. And we have, I remember being kicked out of the Ethan Allen room with a group of people and conversations that eventually led to Act 60 back in the late 90s. So I've had the privilege of working in Vermont for a very long time. You've always had small schools. I remember Bill Mathis visiting him in Rutland and is pointing out that there's no elementary classroom that has more than 12 children. And so that was and those were in the days before our adequacy model was being developed and really coming into a sense of having confidence in what it is. I would say that the differences you see when we talk to people in Vermont and we look at schools that are very successful, we did some case studies in 2015 where we looked at schools that I guess the simplest term is look for schools that punch above their weight. You look at the demographics of students and your sense is their test scores are better than schools that have similar demographics in across the state and across the country. And what are they doing? And what we typically find is the alignment with our model and what's being done in the school is very high. And we find that the people who are there get the support they need and know what it is they need to do. So that it's both, it's three things. And I think I see a lot of it. I think Vermont educators are by and large, highly dedicated, which is required. I think the leadership of the people in schools, school leaders and district leaders is strong and committed to student learning and helping teachers do that. And we're like everywhere else, we see the concern for and the implementation of more professionals to help with beyond the direct pedagogical needs in the classroom. In 2015, we did studies in Michigan, Maryland, Vermont, and Wyoming. And in the study, in the PJ panels that we conducted, the evidence-based PJ panels that we conducted, everybody said we need more mental health counseling services. Since the pandemic, that just has grown louder. My sense is in general, the people in Vermont schools know what to do. Now, whether they could do it as well or better with fewer resources is it's an empirical question that we've really typically not addressed. I've never met a school official who told me, yeah, I have too much money. And I never think I will. And I would be distressed if they did. Okay. So and I don't want to disagree with them or I think one of the things that moved us into Wyoming was I told the legislative committee, I'm never going to tell you that you can't spend more money than my model estimates. I would never think that would be something I should tell you. Their previous consultant had told them that. So that's how I got the job. But I believe that it really, these are, I mean, in Vermont, you're very much locally controlled about how much you spend. And you've worked very hard to make sure that every district or every school or every child has access to the wealth of the state rather than the wealth of the individual location where they live. So that's been a long and changing process that's been really interesting to watch and be at least peripherally involved with. And your system I think it largely achieves that goal. I have the privilege of having a year's sabbatical starting in July. And one of the things I hope to do is actually visit the states where I've worked for a long time and try to understand what's happened over time. So I'd say like in a year and a half or 2 years, Zoe, I can answer your question really, really well. Today, I'm just sort of thinking about my past experience, and it's helpful to think about exactly what you asked. So that's what I hope to be able to do in the near term. So that's half an answer, I know, and I apologize for that.
Thank you so much for taking this time with us. We look forward to many more conversations in the next few months, as well as hosting you in July, which is a great time to visit Vermont.
It may be a little after July, but I'll probably start with Catherine, just as my person I know best, and then help her get me in touch with all the folks. And I'd really love, what I really would like to come out is in the fall and enjoy your foliage as well.
Yes.
So, and when school's in session, which is helpful to talk to school people. But I very much have cherished the time I've spent in Vermont, and while traveling to Vermont for a short legislative hearing would be really challenging, and Zoom or Teams makes it really helpful. I miss the opportunities to come visit your state and look forward to opportunities to do so again. So thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So folks, we're gonna take a quick stretch break and be back at our computers at 11:38. See you then. Hello again.
Hello.
Hello.
Wow. Thanks, everyone. I have heated up my 2 separate cups of tea. And I hope everyone else had something as satisfying to do with their 8 minutes. So I think next we are going to move to essentially Vermont in context. This is going to be our first chance to look at some of the work that the great consulting team that the Agency of Education has put together has been doing. And so I'm excited about that. We're going to look at both data and then just sort of how Vermont sits in the bigger picture. So we're going to have sort of one presentation, questions, and then another presentation and questions. And I think, Zoe, you wanted to kick this all off for us.
Yes, be happy to. So the Agency of Education has hired 2 consultants to increase our statewide capacity to support data-driven and research-based planning with the goal of aligning the agency's work with educational priorities from across communities. APA and New Solutions are our consultants, and they are national experts in education finance policy. Both APA and New Solutions K-12 have extensive working experience in Vermont, as you heard through Larry's overview, and therefore understand the nuances of our state's educational delivery approach and our funding model. And so while collaborating to ensure alignment, we have established chief responsibilities for each consultant to maximize their impact and help accelerate the work of the agency. APA, led by Justin Silverstein, is primarily supporting the agency's Listen and Learn tour, which includes facilitating planning with stakeholder groups and producing topical reports related to a range of indicators, including qualitative themes from educator and community engagement sessions. Amanda Brown from APA is also on the call to answer questions. New Solutions K-12, led by Nate Levinson, is taking the lead to enhance the agency's educational finance reporting, training, and targeted support to the field and school budgeting. David James from New Solutions K-12 will also present findings on today's call. As we review different cost containment and quality improvement strategies, we are focused on tailoring this work to the Vermont context. This work involves engaging deeply with our educators and communities, which is part of the Agency of Education's ongoing efforts in the field. And today we will share high-level themes around Vermont's funding model in the context of national practices and a preliminary analysis of cost drivers, staffing, and enrollment. To start the presentation today, we will first walk through the data that will be led by David James and Justin Silverstein, and then Nate Levinson will provide some broader framing around how Vermont's education funding system compares to other states in the country. So with that, I will turn it over to David James from New Solutions K-12. And David, would you like me to share my screen, or would you like to walk through the slides on your screen?
Let me see if I can pull it up on my end here. If I can share the window. Is that coming through okay for folks?
Yes.
It is, all right. The one kicker is I can't see anybody, so hopefully y'all are still there. Secretary Saunders, I would just ask that folks raise hands throughout the presentation. Feel free to jump in and let me know, given I can't see that on my screen as I'm presenting.
I'm actually going to ask us to hold questions until you are done presenting so that you have a chance to get through what you have.
That works. Great. Thank you. Well, let's see. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is David James, Managing Director here with New Solutions K-12. I'm really excited to be talking with you all today and sharing some of what are still some of the preliminary things and data points that we're seeing as it relates to enrollment, staffing, and spending in the state. And a lot of the reason that we've been brought on board and have been asked to put some of this information in front of you all is to make sure there's some clarity on what is the current state of practices related to enrollment and staffing and spending, and how does that compare both within the state as well as to other state examples. And so today we're hoping to lay out some high level initial trends and engage in a conversation with you all to think about some of the points that Secretary Saunders offered up around what are the next steps and where does it make sense to dig a little bit deeper into data, all with the idea of informing some of the strategies of the state as it thinks about practices to improve cost containment and adjust to the changing enrollment and changing environment in the Vermont education context. My quick background: started my career as a middle school science teacher in the Massachusetts area, but I've been consulting with schools and districts for nearly a decade at this point, and I've had the pleasure and honor of working with a number of schools, SUs and SDs in Vermont on some really specific staffing and scheduling plans, and so I've often seen how a lot of these statewide trends play out in practice at the school or at the district level. The other thing I'll note about our work is that we've been working on putting together a report that really summarizes in as kind of straightforward language as possible how education funding and spending work in the state. So that's a report that I know Secretary Saunders will provide more kind of context on a little bit later or over the course of the next couple of weeks and months. But that's something that I think some of the ideas that we share today are represented in that report. And we understand that, kind of as Mr. Pikus was sharing, or Dr. Pikus, the funding system in Vermont is, I guess you could say, complex, especially relative to other states. And it's part of the reason we're spending so much time here on the front end, making sure there's clarity in how things work and how that impacts the schools and the districts, such that we can provide some targeted recommendations going forward. Before I get into this any further, just now, I'll turn it to you to offer up an opportunity for other context or points that you'd want to share here on the front end for folks.
Thanks, David. Just quick introduction, Justin Silverstein. I run the school finance shop at Augenblick Pelation Associates. We're a Denver-based firm who's been doing school finance work and education policy work for a little over 40 years. Really been excited for the past couple of months to be helping the agency with its Listen and Learn tour and creating some of the initial level setting data that we've been able to present to the state and regions and to different stakeholder groups. I'm actually in a hotel in Burlington and on the way down to Montpelier for this evening's Listen and Learn. So, really happy to be here, and much of what you'll be seeing that Amanda and I will be presenting is information that's being presented kind of publicly at these Listen and Learn meetings.
All right, excellent. Well, a couple things to get us started. Purpose of a lot of these analyses today are for the reasons that you see here. One is to build preliminary understanding of Vermont staffing and spending landscape and how enrollment work in the state. We want to be able to document some high-level trends for folks and give you a space to offer or ask up some questions and think about and give us some guidance in terms of where does it make sense to dig a little bit deeper based on what are some of the needs and challenges you're hearing or seeing from folks that you work with in K-12 in Vermont. I'd say a number of the points that we'll share today, just as Justin alluded to, have been included in the Vermont Education State Profile. And so there's a whole lot of detail in that document, some of which will be shared today, some of which we're sharing today is not in that document. But I think that offers up a lot of additional context if you're looking for more than what we cover in the presentation today. And then part of this presentation also is, I say begin, but really continue the conversation around what are some of the strategies that SUs or SDs can pursue to reduce costs while maintaining or even improving educational delivery. And by that, I mean, New Solutions, I know APA is in the same boat, really comes at this with the idea that it is possible both to provide more cost-effective education to students and a better education to students. And I think that's a point that Dr. Pikus emphasized as well, that you can spend less while also doing the same, if not better, for students. And that's a high-level mindset that we approach this work both in Vermont and elsewhere at, and something that I think should be kept in mind through these conversations, that it's not just about cost cutting, it's about making the most of resources that you have and doing the best for students possible within that. The other note that I'll share on the data side of things is that I know there's been extensive efforts and ongoing efforts to compile and clean and summarize data at the state level. There's, over the past couple of years, we understand, been a lot of efforts to make sure that data is rolled up in an accurate way and shared from the school districts in an accurate way. And so all the data that we'll be sharing today is as clean and as accurate as we understand it can possibly be. We also know there are certain areas in which kind of data roll-up is an ongoing effort at the state. So we'll put a kind of asterisk on the data in that sense. Though I can answer more about that a little bit later. So a couple big points I'd say right off the bat when we looked at these three big areas across the state: enrollment, staffing, and expenditures. First is that we've seen, and I imagine most folks in the room have a clear understanding that public school enrollment has declined in Vermont over the past 20 years. state has many relatively small SUs and SDs, especially relative to other states that we see. A big point of that enrollment was declining prior to the pandemic, and I know we've seen pretty significant enrollment declines nationally and in other states that we work with. So Vermont is not unique in that way, but as we'll share, it really does put increasing financial pressure on SDs and SUs as they think about providing services and staffing. And I think we'll really push SUs and SDs to think differently about how they staff and how they're providing those services, just because there's fewer students to provide those services to. And past practice may not be a financially sustainable practice going forward. On the staffing side of things, we interestingly saw that the smallest districts in the state, or SUs and SDs, have more staff per 100 students across just about every staff group that we looked at: leadership, teachers, student support staff, and so on. And so I think this really speaks to the point that as schools and districts and as the state works with those districts, really can cost effectively serve students in a way that I think we'll have to kind of force them to think about alternative or different strategies for staffing than they've used in the past. I mean, that's shared staff, I mean, that's part-time staff, I mean, that's multi-role staff of someone at the district level or district leadership level wearing multiple hats. And as Dr. Pike just shared, something like an AP, does that make sense in an elementary school that has very low enrollment? And I think that's one of the biggest areas to potentially look deeper into for the state as it thinks about staffing strategies to recommend for schools of varying sizes, recognizing those shouldn't all be the same. And then on the expenditure side, one of the big things that we saw is first the expenditures per ADM or average daily membership. We'll share more about that in a moment, are higher in the smallest SUs and SDs. In other words, the smallest school districts are spending more per student than their larger peers. And a second big point we saw is that, as expected, staff salaries make up the largest amount of any district spending, though the amount districts spend on paraeducators is quite a bit higher than we'll see in other states. Paraeducators represent about 10% of total salaries statewide. And we usually see some figure quite a bit lower than that in other states that we work with. I think that speaks to the point that districts really can work towards reducing reliance on paraeducators or reallocating some of those funds to other priorities. Let me stop there for just a second. Secretary Saunders or Justin, other things that you'd share right up front just on a couple of these big ideas. If you're shaking your heads, no, I can't see it. So
no, I'm good.
I don't hear anything. All right.
Continue, David.
Great. All right, let's dig a little bit deeper into enrollment here to begin with. It's an important nuance about kind of Vermont and how you think about enrollment and how the state thinks about enrollment. There's really four categories and 4 ways that students are counted. The first is the most straightforward, and I guess what you might say is the most traditional, of how many students are physically present in a school or in a district. What are the number of students that have butts in seats on a given day? And that's typically what we see schools and districts using for enrollment figures, which then are used to inform staffing figures. If you say you have this many students, well, you're going to break them into this many different classes or sections, and that will inform how many teachers or staff you need to provide services to those students. It gets a little more complicated when you think about some of the context that Vermont has, that some students may be assigned to a district, but are actually taking classes and attending a school in a different district. And that's where this ADM figure comes into play. 2 ways that's looked at. One is the annual unweighted ADM. So how many students a district funds in public and independent settings. In other words, how many students a district is financially responsible for, even if that student isn't physically attending a school in that district. For example, if a district is only servicing elementary students, they may then be on the hook to provide funding for that student as they go to a high school in a different district, as we understand it. And then for some of the calculations at the state level, long-term ADM is used, and that's looking at a 2-year average of those ADM figures. And then the final part is around equalized pupil counts, and this is how many students are counted in the homestead tax rate calculation after some of the weights that the state uses are applied based on different student needs and characteristics and demographics that you can see listed there. Justin, other things that you'd add about some of these perspectives on how students are counted?
I mean, I think the biggest piece and one of the things that we hear a lot about is the balance between enrollment versus ADM in different parts of the state. I mean, this is a really big conversation when you think about the Northeast and the Kingdom. Just lots of kids who are being tuitioned both to other schools, other districts, but also to independent schools. And this is less of an issue, right, in some other places. So kind of where you're sitting really bubbles this up as a bigger concern, how you count kids in different parts of the state.
Great.
The only thing I would add to that is, as we think about this as a committee, it's important to break down these different counts and understand how we can use them to inform our planning, both thinking about this in terms of programmatic considerations, funding considerations, and quality considerations. So it's helpful to do this type of dissection, but we also, as we go forward in the presentation and in future planning, need to be very intentional and clear about how we're defining student counts.
Yeah, and I think that point.
I'm sorry, can you clarify on the slide before this, which of these 4 categories did you use?
Yeah, on this one?
Yeah.
So enrollment is most specifically related to butts in seats, number of students in attending that school or district. And Justin and Amanda can share a bit more about that in a slide that we'll see here in just a moment. On the staffing side of things, that was those are some figures based on student enrollment figures. So that the first point here, the actual public school enrollment, the butts in seats. And then when it came to some of the funding analyses that we'll show, that was based on the ADM.
Yeah, so we'll go, as we go through today, David and Justin, if you could just point out and reinforce on the different slides how the student counts are used and why, so that we can promote understanding.
Yeah, can do. All right, well, Justin, I'll turn it to you on this slide.
Perfect. So we're going to start off with a couple slides that really do focus on enrollment. And so we're looking at enrollment on this slide is on that solid green line. And when we think of total enrollment in public schools, we're thinking pre-K count through adult ed. And so what you'll see is there was a dramatic decrease, since 2003-04 to today, it's around a 14.5% decrease. But when you look at the dotted line right below that, I think where you see even a larger kind of decline is in the actual K-12 public enrollment. So students in public schools, K-12, and that is over 21% decline. What we see down below is in the black dotted line, an increase in pre-K over time. Partly that's because of the UPK, the universal pre-K, more kids in the system, not necessarily more pre-K age students, but more kids in the system. And then 2 things that really pop up coming out of the pandemic was an increase in independent school enrollment, both publicly and privately funded, which you see in the red, which went up right around the time of the pandemic, has come down a little bit and leveled off, but then also a big increase in home study, again, leveling or even decreasing a little bit. And then finally, what we have on here is kind of CTE students and where they sit. About 5,000 CTE students in any given year, plus or minus. And those students are obviously part of public schools, but they kind of sit in their public setting differently. Some students are going to CTE half-time, some are going full-time. So again, overall kind of count of those CTE students, though, pretty consistent right around that 5,000 student level. We can go to the next slide. So on this slide, again, we're sticking with enrollment. So where students serve day to day to get a picture of how many students are in the kind of the traditional districts, and then how many students are being served in independent school settings. What you see is the vast majority of students in 22-23 were being served in public schools, over 80,000 students. Around 2,000 students, a little over 2,000 students were attending the private academies or the independent schools academies. Then we have a little under 600 students going to therapeutic schools. Those are really students who are being served, who are special education students are being served. And then we have 842 students who are attending other independent schools. And so these are all students attending school in-state. There are some counts where students would be going out of state, but this is the in-state set of students and where they are being educated in 22-23. Go to the next slide. And then again, looking at enrollment by SU, this slide here just gives a sense of the number of students in enrollment. Again, so this is students served, not students who are the SU is responsible for. That would be a higher count in many cases. And what you'll see here is, I think as folks know, a lot of districts with a large geographic spread, but still relatively small number of students. And so if you go up to the Northeast region, especially, you'll see large districts with pretty light coloring. That means large geographic span, but low number of students enrolled. And then you can see other parts of the state with the dark green, which is your highest enrolled districts. And again, there's some spread on geography, but you've got a number of districts with much higher density. So smaller geographic footprint, but higher, large number of students.
All right. And if we dig a little bit deeper into the staffing side of things, and hopefully that gives folks just again, preliminary high-level overview of enrollment in the state and some of the trends that we thought were notable to share. When we think about staffing, we looked at a particular set of data that was staffing per 100 students. And so this looks at, for different types of roles, how many staff, or excuse me, how many staff are assigned to students, which I think is a good way to kind of equalize isn't the right term, but make an apples to apples comparison across schools based on their actual student enrollment. So this doesn't deal with the ADM or the other types of enrollment variables. This is just students in seat and students served. And so we looked at this data across four types of groups.
I'm sorry to interrupt again. I just it's hard to look at the data without the context. So students served isn't a definition we have in statute. What is that? Are you counting? Is that just publicly funded students and seats? Is that are you including tuition students? Usually ADM is what we use for butts and seats, and it's usually long-term ADM. And that's sort of what we requested for our data. Okay.
Yeah, my understanding, Justin, let me know if I'm off on this, is that this is butts and seats staffing compared to that enrollment figure.
Yeah, so this database has a number of students enrolled in the building, and then number of staff serving that building. So that is a contained. So it would, I think to your point, include any student coming from any place that was being served in that public school.
Yeah.
So this is just public school students?
Yes.
Yeah, so in the analysis as we go through today, we'll also be looking at ADM. When we're looking at staffing, we're looking at that within the 96% of students that are enrolled in a public school. This is helpful also for us to do comparative analysis with other states as we are moving through this planning. We also, in this presentation, will look at ADM, which is really looking at how we fund the cost of education overall. So we'll walk through that, but for staffing, we're looking at those 96% of students and how those staffing matrices are organized within public school settings.
Yeah, thank you for those clarifications. Well, then the four different groups that we were looking at, first was teachers, which includes all teachers pre-K through 12. That includes special education teachers. We then looked at leadership, so positions like principals, assistant principals, department heads, and the like. Third group was student support, and so this includes positions such as school psychologists, math interventionists, say literacy specialists, folks who are providing some very targeted students in the realm of student support, and then also student services, a little bit different than student support positions such as nurse aides, librarians, guidance counselors, that are providing services less on kind of the purely academic side and more kind of on student, I guess how would you say, addressing students either social emotional or some of the kind of operational periphery needs of the school. And so when we ran the numbers on this, pulled together this chart, and to walk you through this, you can see we segmented SUs into four different enrollment groups. Group 1 was less than 1,000 students, Group 2, Group 3, and Group 4. So we just wanted to get a sense of across different sized SUs, how do some of these staffing ratios compare? You can see the total number of SUs and SDs included in each of those 4 groups. So roughly equally split across those 4 different groups in terms of the number of SUs represented in each. And then the figures, this is just for 2022 to 2023 staffing ratios. The highest level trend here that you see is that the smallest districts in the state have more staff per 100 students across just about all staff groups than all other sized SUs and SDs. So for example, you can see Group 1 has the highest ratio of teachers per 100 students at 12.5 relative to 11.3, 10.8, and 10.5 for the other enrollment size groups. And that's the trend that continues for leaders, for student service positions, and students, apologies.
And did you, I'm sorry to interrupt again, did you exclude districts that tuition?
No, that's
so let's try to clarify here as we're looking at staffing. So as we look at staffing, we're looking at how we deliver education in our public school settings. When we look at how we fund education, we're looking at ADM when we're also accounting for those students that are tuitioned. So these are looking at the students, or 96% of our students that are attending a public school, and looking at those staffing ratios. We will look at tuitioning patterns also later in the presentation. And so that's, I think, just an important distinction, is thinking about how we're delivering education versus how we're funding education are different points of analyses.
So I appreciate that. I still don't understand. So we have school districts where administrative staff are public staff but have tuition. So I am having troubles with my apples, oranges, and bananas, but we can work that out later.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can try one more time, and I agree. So the database itself is site-based on the staffing side. So if we think of an elementary, or let's go to a high school that might have 80% of its students from its own SU, and let's say 20% coming in from another SU. The database itself, as I understand, is agnostic to the who is paying for these staff, because we're looking just at total number of staff. But we are saying that for this total group of high school students, there are this many teachers, there's this many leaders, this many student support service staff, if that makes sense. So in this sense, you're absolutely right. We are not worrying about the who's paying for it. We're worried about where the students are served and how many educators are there to serve them. So that's how I understand this database. You're absolutely right. We're going to turn to in a little bit the expenditure side. So how much is spent? And there we actually going to we're going to be looking at ADM. So it's going to be much more about kind of the responsibility side of things. But this is a database, the way it's collected is at the site base to understand the staff who are in front of the students at the time.
So I just wanted to, I think what Emily was getting at, there are staff that exist within a public school whose role it is to support students who are tuitioned outside. So it sounds like this can't capture that, but I think it's important to acknowledge that even if a student is not being educated within the public school, if they're in a therapeutic environment, even if they're in another independent school, there are responsibilities that district or school has to those students who are in an independent setting. So this doesn't capture that, which is fair enough. We just need to name that.
Yeah, and there's a level of detail where we could probably pull that out, Zoe, so we could take a look if we can find those folks.
Yeah, so I think this is getting into questions around really the responsibilities and the scope of responsibilities that may go beyond the oversight of those students that are within the public school setting. So that might look at a central office staff member that is also responsible for some oversight and accountability functions for those students that are tuitioned to an independent school, or maybe even tuition to another public school where there's some coordination between and across the districts. So that level of analysis starts getting into roles and responsibilities of staff members. Here we're really looking at the staff per 100 students as a first phase of analysis, while acknowledging that there are complexities around the scope of roles and how that might be different and variable depending on the complexity of the tuitioning patterns.
but point well taken. And I think, the numbers we're looking at here are really just that, the pure numbers. It doesn't take into account some of those roles and responsibilities that folks have to serve and support students that are tuitioned out of their district. All right, Justin or Secretary Saunders, other points that you want to make about some of these staffing trends that we saw before we move on?
The only thing I would note is that, these are this is an initial and preliminary view as we look at it by these groupings. And I think it's important to recognize that not all schools operate the same across the state. And so as we go into the next phase of analysis, there's opportunities to look within these groups and begin to identify kind of how they might be structured differently and what are some model practices that we can look at that are really working effectively in different parts of the state within these groupings as well. That is not part of this preliminary presentation, but is part of the work that we're doing on the ground and engaging with our education leaders and communities and really understanding the opportunities and challenges as we think about continuing to elevate our education system.
All right, well then let's take a look at the expenditure side of things as well. So Justin, I'll turn it to you here to run us through these first couple of slides.
Great. And so here's where we are turning to looking at everything by ADM. And we were using here a single year ADM figure. And so the expenditures that we are looking at are all the expenditures in an SU for all students they're responsible for in the ADM. And I think there was the mention of tuition. And so one of the key things here that we're doing is to take out where there would be a double count of tuition between sending and receiving. And so we've used what we call the recipe card that the AOE uses to make sure that we don't double count expenditures on either side. And we have those expenditures only associated with the SUSD that kind of owns that student in their ADM. And so what we'll see here is a couple of things is that there's been about a $5,000 increase per pupil on average across the state in expenditures from the 1920 school year to the 2022-23 school year. Within that, though, you will actually see that kind of the state local dollars into that total pot has actually gone down as a percentage of that per pupil amount. And the federal funding has gone up during that time. That, of course, is right around the time of the pandemic and additional federal funding coming in to help address the impacts of the pandemic. And so you'll see that as a percent of total and really even as a per pupil amount, federal funding has doubled or actually more than doubled during that time. So I think we have an expectation of that federal funding will come down a little bit over time as we look at this total cost picture. Generally, the kind of other and undefined amount stayed pretty much the same. So kind of where you see the biggest change is that federal and the state.
All right, Secretary Saunders, did you want to walk us through this slide?
So this is looking at the education fund appropriations. This is based on the emergency board meeting that took place on July 30th in terms of the overall outlook. I know the committee was interested in identifying some of the kind of what would be considered more of the off the top spending from the education fund and how that has changed over time and what the outlook is here. So this is a list of all of those appropriations looking at the 2023 actual, 2024 actual, and the 2025 projected. So just wanted to have this as a base, as a reference point as we continue to go through our planning.
Justin, back to you.
Okay. And so the next slide just takes the information that we saw at kind of 2 slides up and breaks it out into the spending by size grouping. What you'll see is the pattern is that the smaller districts, those under 1,000, the smaller SUSDs, spend more per pupil. It drops down as you get a little bit bigger and then flattens out around kind of over about 1,400 students. think one piece that's important to remember here is that the smaller SUSDs, though they are spending more per pupil, they also tend to serve a higher need student population. So their percentage of economically disadvantaged students, EL and special education students as a whole tends to be higher than the other SUs in the state. And there are also two SUs that seem to have some outlier data within size group 1. We have reached out to those SUs individually just to really understand their data. The pattern would stay the same, though the spending per pupil would drop a little bit in that category if those two SUs were excluded.
Excellent. And as a quick note, I just want to welcome Nate Levinson, my colleague, who's joining us in the conversation as well. Nate, welcome, and certainly feel free to jump in as you have other thoughts going forward. Well, then the last couple of things we wanted to share here as we looked at expenditures were some of the trends that we saw year over year, both kind of statewide on the primary objective codes or categories or expenditure categories that the state uses, as well as digging in deeper to 3 of them specifically. So what you're seeing here is total statewide expenditures, how much money SUs and SDs are spending in total across from 2020 to 2023. And so we separate that into a set of 8 or 9 object codes, and these are the object codes that the state uses to roll up these different expenditure categories. So you can see things like personnel services, salaries, i.e. the salaries of teachers, staff, etc., other purchase services, and we'll show what those will be here in just a moment, and on down the line. And so the second column or the middle column on this chart shows the percent of total expenditures across a 4-year period. So that 45% essentially says across that 4-year period from 2020 to 2023, personnel services salaries of staff of schools and districts represented 45% of total expenditures during that time. So about half of all education related expenditures at the SU and SD level were salary based. The other thing we were curious about is how those spending patterns changed over that 4-year period. And so the last column that you see here is the percent change. It's not the percentage point change, but the percent change of those expenditures from 2020 to 2023. And so there you can see salaries increased by 13% from 2020, and I should say salary expenditures, not salaries as a different angle, but salary expenditures increased by 13% from 2020 to 2023. And the thing that stood out to us is that while those top 3 categories of salaries, other purchase services, and employee benefits represent by far the bulk of expenditures in state, about 80%, they were increasing at a lower rate relative to some of the other objective or other expenditure categories that you see a little bit further down that accelerate more quickly over that time. Those still represent.
Just another quick clarifying question. I'm sorry. Are you using the same definition of expenditures here that you used a few slides ago that includes federal revenue, regardless of revenue, regardless of offsetting? This is just total spending in the system. Okay.
Exactly.
And is it safe to assume that this final column, it's all a positive percent change? None of them are a negative percent change?
Correct.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep.
So this clarification for me too, building on that, does this include federal ESSER money?
So this is just pure expenditures of what did districts spend and within what categories. And so this is spending as opposed to funding. And so ESSER funding, I guess, would be reflected in this because they use that funding to spend on these categories, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I would say that's why the property related expenditures went up so much, because ESSER funds were largely targeted towards making improvements to the physical infrastructure, HVAC systems, for example. But I think what we have asked for as a committee is the education fund payment. So the amount of money that goes to districts for their operating budget that they vote on every year by object. So I believe that salaries and benefits would comprise a larger share of that. And I also want to clarify that tuition payments is that other purchase service? it'd be nice to see what tuition payments
Yeah.
are as a separate category, because, and I think when you get into some of the smallest districts and their high cost per pupil, what I'd be interested in is what proportion of that is tuition related, which they don't control, versus costs that they do have some control over in the current system.
Yeah, I'm just making quick note of that.
And I think that would be, I think the ESSER funding is important to make a note of at the bottom. Those of us watching it who work in schools and understand the financing system can assume that, but if I'm a general member of the public who may not be thinking of that, I'd be alarmed by some of this.
You know, I think that's a good point, right? When we had some additional infusion of dollars through ESSER, this is how the needs were identified and how additional funding was spent, right? So it is an interesting picture as we think about the needs of our schools when additional funding became available, how that was used. And I do hear the request also for us to look at specifically from the Ed Fund and really understanding the revenue sources. So absolutely, that's a part of the analysis. And then as we go forward in the next couple of slides, we'll actually be able to break out within these top 3 categories what is included within that as well. So I'll allow you to proceed, David.
And I ask people to hold questions till the end, and I'm not doing that because I realize that I'm having trouble actually even processing the information in the slides without having some of those questions answered. So I'm trying to separate sort of clarifying questions from content questions, but it's hard and I apologize.
No, that's quite all right. Please continue asking. Okay, well then the last couple points to make here, and this is where we start to break out those top 3 spending categories. This is what you're looking at here is just that personnel services salary. So this is just the salaries expenditure category. As a quick reminder, that represented about 45% of total expenditures. And so when you look across the board here on these stack bar charts that you see, you'll see that teacher salaries represent about 64% of those total salaries, as you might expect. And then it's broken down into a couple other roles that you see listed there on the right: paraeducator, administrator salaries, and so on. One of the points that I know I highlighted earlier was that the percent of salaries that are going to paraeducators, around 9 or 10%, is higher than we typically see in other states. And I think that speaks to the fact of how some schools and districts that we worked with in the past have relied on paraeducators in more or different ways than we've typically seen or wouldn't necessarily recommend. But I think this gives you a sense that, all right, the amount districts are spending on different roles isn't changing that much year to year. For example, the amount of districts spent on teacher salaries was 63% in 2020. It was 62% in 2023. So the amount that is allocated to each of these different positions is relatively consistent year over year. It's more about what percent is going to different roles that stood out to us paraeducators in particular. Nate, is there anything that you'd add for context on that? I know, having worked in a lot of different states and have thought a lot about the paraeducator question in particular.
Sure. Afternoon, everybody. Sorry I couldn't join at the beginning. What we've seen is 2 things across the country, is that the use of paraeducators really is just a state norm, or the not use of paraeducators being a state norm, that it really is very state by state, rather than a particular strategy or even a particular phase or a response to the environment or context. It is really historically driven. And that's one thing. The other piece, which I know not everybody will agree with, but the research has just been consistent for 20 or 30 years, that it is generally not the most beneficial investment. To be clear, there are some really, really necessary, critical, and important roles for paraeducators. You can't run a school system without them. But the issue in the states that have relied more heavily on them, the research has said that it's simply just not led to better outcomes for students, and in many cases, actually worse outcomes for a number of students.
Great. Well then, to zoom in on a different.
And then I'm sorry, I have one more clarifying question.
Sure.
Is that last slide, is this, what's the mix of this being salary increases versus staff increases?
It's a great question.
As the cost drive.
Yeah, it's a great question. This data doesn't kind of splice or separate that out. This is just saying how much a district is spending on staffing. And so we'd have to go back and take a look to see for those increases. And you can see that the total expenditures have been increasing over the course of the 4 years. What we're driven by more staff versus increased staff salaries. Yeah, that's not something that this represents, and we'd have to go back and look a little bit more deeply into to give you a concrete answer on.
Yeah, we have done some trend analysis also in terms of teacher salaries by all of these positions, looking at the minimum, maximum, and the median, and also comparability across the state. So I don't know if Justin, you want to just do some initial reflections on what we saw in that analysis.
Yeah, and I'm going to tag Amanda here too to think about it. But we generally have been seeing increases in salaries over time in this kind of 4-year window. So I do think we've seen that piece. I can't tell you if it would make this specific do the math here if it's both increases in salary and staff, but we've definitely seen some increases in salary over the past couple of years. So that's part of this growth for sure.
All right, then if we zoom in on a different expenditure category, this is the other purchased services, which certainly can mean a lot of different things, but what it exactly means is what you see listed there on the right. So it includes categories such as tuition, general operations, transportation, etc. And so this, I think, gets to one of the questions around tuitioning and what are some of the details on that. You can see here, tuitioning makes up about 50% of these other purchased services. In a given year, of that 50%, about half of that goes to private schools relative to other public schools in the state. We received some questions along the line as well about the special education excess costs and what that accounts for. In this case, it's a relatively small percent, 1% of the total other purchase services spending over the course of this time frame. And so again, what you'll see here is that the percentages of the different categories don't change that much year over year, but actually remain relatively constant. Tuition again being about half of that. Let me just pause here because I know folks did have questions on tuitioning. Were there any particular wonderings that people had on that?
We have not very many minutes left, and so I think I'm going to ask you to
now pause. Let's keep going.
Fly through and keep going. And I think we could, each person in this room, spend 8 hours on each of these slides. So I think we're going to need to do a much more sort of comprehensive data sharing conversation.
Yeah, great. Well, then let's keep moving. The last category that we dug into was the third highest expenditure category. This was personnel services, employee benefits. And this you can see, actually as a quick reminder, this category represented about 18% of total expenditures. And of all this, about 61% goes to employee health insurance over the course of a given year, the rest to other benefits and retirement, just to give you a sense of what's going into those benefits and how those are all broken out. And I believe we're just towards the end here. One other angle that we looked at this was for total expenditures and how much those changed by those enrollment groups of different district sizes that we had referenced earlier in the presentation. So this shows you what is the percentage change in total expenditures by those different groups, again, from 2020 to 2023. And there you can see that some of the smaller districts had a relatively lower increase from expenditures over that time frame compared to some of their larger districts. And I think that can be driven by many different factors, some of which we need to dig deeper on ourselves. But this gives you a sense of where or which types of districts or what size districts were increasing spending more or less relative to their peers. All right, and then I think Justin, you can bring us home with the last two slides here.
last two slides. So this first slide is just kind of level setting what the data you'll see on the next slide. So one of the things we wanted to try to put together is a lot of the information we've just talked about. So size of districts, their spending per pupil, and then also bringing into account their need. In this case, we're measuring need using free reduced price lunch. It's a proxy for economically, disadvantaged students in a district. And then trying to start to lay out kind of where do different SUs and SDs fall. Are some higher performing and high spending, which is your top right, others in the bottom left, lower performing, low spending, and then top left is higher performing, lower spending, and bottom right is lower performing and higher spending, and see if we kind of see any patterns about the characteristics of those districts when we do this. Key point here, we're moving on and using another denominator here with students, and you can go to the next slide, it's fine, David. And we're using equalized pupils in this case. So what you will see here is total expenditures. So it's the same total expenditure information we used on some prior slides divided by the equalized students. So that's going to do kind of one major thing. It should, and it appears, start to kind of group the spending per pupil a little bit more because we're using equalized pupils, not the raw ADM. So like we are taking into account the need that was there as those budgets were built. And then what you'll see on this graph here is that the larger the circle, the larger the district, clearly the smaller the circle, the smaller the district. Any district in green, it has relatively low need as measured by free reduced price lunch. Any district or any circle here with red has higher need. And so really what we start to see is that those districts that are higher performing and lower spending, they tend to have less student need. So you see that in that top left quadrant, higher performing, lower spending, almost all of them are in green. The lower performing, lower spending SUs tend to be both somewhat larger, but also tend to have much higher need. And the larger settings tend to be lower spending generally, which is part of the patterns that we've already shown. So this just starts to try to put the different data together. As a group, we are also trying to think of different ways we can use these quads to try to get an understanding of what other characteristics are impacting performance and spending.
All right, so I'll stop sharing. That was the set of slides and information we wanted to share with you all today. Secretary Saunders, Justin, Nate, other points that you want to share with folks here to kind of close out that part of the presentation today?
I think just to share that we would need to look at this in a lot of different ways and really be thoughtful around how we're analyzing this information and how we use it to drive our next steps. So I think, as Justin mentioned, as we start to pull all these different pieces together, it's important to look at a lot of the different variables that are impacting spending and also impacting performance so that we can really be grounded in what's working and where there's opportunities to, to make some improvements. I think all of this work certainly needs to happen in conjunction with the field. And that's why as we start to look at these data presentations, they're a way for us to really begin the conversation and the dialogue. We're also bringing in some more of the contextual elements to this analysis. So we're engaged in a lot of planning and focus groups with educators and community members. And those themes are also important to bring together as we create a holistic understanding of our education system and what are some of the drivers and patterns as it relates to spending and performance, and also looking at the overall equity of our system. So just appreciate the opportunity to begin to pull this together, and want to note that there's certainly other layers of analysis that are needed. Many of the questions that you brought up today, I think, are really helpful and really clear that beyond just looking at overall expenditure, it's really being able to dive deeper into the sources, particularly around the ed fund and what that entails, in addition to the appropriations that we brought into the conversation today. We will share, I know this presentation will be posted, and we will be releasing some other data as well to support everyone's planning as we dive deeper into this work. I did want to give an opportunity, if there's still time, and I'll ask the chair that, if Nate Levinson can also help to put some of this in context, just kind of briefly framing how Vermont's system compares to other states, I think is helpful for context as we move forward, if there is time for that.
I think we can take like 5 minutes for that. And Nate, if that feels like an absurd thing to do, we can skip it and do it another day. For me, that feels like an absurd thing to do. But before we go to you,
oh, sorry,
I just want to name just a few sort of data anomalies that have come up and that I've heard from folks about during the course of the meeting. One, equalized pupils don't exist in law anymore, and so it's a confusing variable to be using. We've had very specific, consistent requests from this committee to go back pre-pandemic with any data analysis. Long-term ADM is sort of our standard unit of measurement in Vermont. And I think we're going to need to sort of to reconnect before our next data conversation to make sure that we're really seeing what we need to be seeing to make the decisions that we need to make. I know you guys are working with like a huge amount of data, and you're getting, you're doing specific things for the agency that are very useful to the agency. I think this committee also has very specific needs that I want to make sure we're able to meet. And I thank you so much for the great work that you have done thus far. So thank you for joining us. Nate, would you like to join us another time, or do you want to just have the floor for 3 minutes to wax eloquent at us? So sorry.
What I've got to say will probably take more than 3, so happy to have the time, unless Commissioner. So Saunders, do you want to do a very quick, what are the key points, or do we want to find the time to do it more comprehensively?
I think you had kind of 2 main takeaways that would be helpful to communicate, and then we will be releasing a report that is more comprehensive that walks through those differences.
Great. So I will do this very briefly. As we think about the Vermont context, 2 things really stand out. And I say this from somebody who's worked a great deal in Vermont and in at least 29 other states as well. And that really is that you fund education differently and you spend education dollars differently. The biggest difference when it comes to funding, while all states are trying to ensure equity, more resources to kids who need more resources, towns with a greater ability to pay, in fact, do pay greater amounts for education, all those things are very similar. Where the real difference comes in most other states, the state is actually doing a very detailed calculation built up by the types of kids you're serving, the size of your district, and many other factors. And the state is actually saying, hey, based on this very thoughtful formula, this is how much it would take to educate a student. It's not, so the state is actually leading that calculation, very equity driven, but it is a number being developed. The second part that's different is if a community wanted to spend more than that number, typically those folks would have to vote on it, and they would be voting on, to a large extent, their own taxes going up to spend beyond the amount that was calculated as a reasonable amount to educate the mix of students you have. So on the funding side, very different. On the spending side, beyond just some of the very specific patterns of paraprofessionals or small class sizes, I wanted to highlight 2 themes that I've seen across Vermont that we didn't see in many other places. The first is what we describe as a desire to go it alone. In most other states, when you see small schools, rural schools, geographically dispersed schools, schools that look like yours, in those places, you generally see a huge amount of regional support, not regional school systems, but collaboratives and collaboration and the sharing of effort and knowledge. You see people not trying to do small schools by themselves. Where in Vermont, we see much more of that. We also see that has led to, I think, a lot of Vermont systems thinking, hey, we are so different that maybe we can't learn from others.
where in other states, there's a greater desire to figure out how to do cost-effective education, given how challenging that is, and they're constantly talking to each other. So definitely this sense of going alone is much deeper here than we see in other states that have similar kinds of schools and communities. Then the second big theme is in other states, not all of them, but a growing number of them, the role of the agency of education is different, where the role of the agency of education is taking on a bigger role, actually offloading some of the work from small school systems. And then the examples being a curriculum review, where states will look at all the high quality curriculums for math, say, hey, these are 3 great ones, here are the pluses and minuses, and that is curriculum work not having to be done at the school or district level. Ultimately, the choice is still local, but a lot of the research being done. Also, just things like staffing strategies and best practice teaching and learning guidance. And a lot of professional development and support coming through often third parties that have been organized and funded through the agency. So just your small school systems have more on their plates than we see in some other places, because in those other places, the agency has taken on some of that role. Happy to go much deeper into all of these, but that's a quick overview of some of the similarities and differences we're seeing.
Thank you. That was very impressive in 3 minutes. I really appreciate it.
Just imagine what I could do in a half an hour.
I can't wait. I can't wait. I'm looking forward to it. Thank you. And I'm looking forward to all of these reports that are coming soon. It's nice to sort of process things in advance and then discuss them in meetings, which is not how we've been operating as a group. And I apologize to the group for that. Thank you very much for your time today. So we have 20 minutes left as a group. The first thing I want to cover before we go into our discussion is just a little bit of housekeeping to make sure I don't lose time for that, which is that our next meeting which is scheduled for November 11th, is Veterans Day. And so folks are not working on that day. Many folks are not working on that day. And so proposing that we move the meeting to November 18th, which is the following week. Many of you who are on the steering committee have a steering committee meeting at that time. Wondering if it's okay with you if the steering committee meeting gets bumped. Megan knows I'm going to ask you all this question. So just don't have to answer now, but just want to sort of put that out there, that it would be sort of our usual timing. We would meet right after the communications subcommittee or outreach subcommittee or whatever it's called meets, and then sort of do our usual go until 1 o'clock. So just wanted to put that out there, and we would have that meeting in person. Okay. Thank you for the thumbs up, Craig, so I don't feel like I am speaking into the great Teams vacuum in the sky. Okay. Discussion. This chart, I would love to get back to together, or if folks want to share anything before we get back to that. Okay, seeing none. I would love to just start going through the chart together and crowdsource answers to that. Does that feel like a good use of time to folks? Nicole, I went through, you got the PDF of the chart, and in the half hour at the beginning of the meeting, I sort of talked through the construct of it, which is fairly straightforward when you're looking at it, but just wanted to sort of explain that. I've done my own version, but I would love to sort of fully crowdsource the whole thing. And we deleted some rows that were duplicative. Does this feel like a good use of time for? Yeah. You're very quiet. I don't know why.
Because my mic was on my head. Sorry about that. Does this PDF document include some of the ideas that were generated at the commission meeting, or is it just from our Jamboard?
It is our Jamboard, the commission meeting, the memo from the V's, and Julia Richter's report, which are all essentially identical brainstorms.
Got it.
But
Thank you.
Includes all of those to the best of my cross-referencing ability. If I left something out, it was not intentional. It was just that there were too many lists that were formatted differently.
Great.
Okay. So the earliest effective date and the date to curb costs are like fairly straightforward, and I feel like less perceptive and more factual. I would love if we talked about the other impacts dynamics and the contingencies and dependencies as a group. Those feel like more looser and would be good to get everyone's heads in the room on that. So I'm going to go through and maybe we can sort of brainstorm the policy goals and the other impacts and dynamics and go from there. Does that sound good? Okay. Requiring school districts to designate up to 3 public schools. Policy goals, other impacts, dynamics, contingencies on that. So for me, and people can just unmute and jump in. So for me, this is has always been spoken about as a way to like prevent the perverse incentives that to move towards privatization that might occur if we move towards economies of scale with our district changes or school changes or class size changes.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's folks have talked about setting up paying for parallel systems, right? And so it would not work well if as a result of closure of schools, more dollars are flowing outside the public education system. So then we still have the remaining public schools are not serving those students. It's sort of leading to the further dilution of our already declining public school enrollment.
Okay.
I agree with that. And just to add to that, that was part of the data I was hoping to see with the expenditures and ADMs. Like what does our public education system cost versus the overall cost? And I hope we can see some of that data in future presentations and help tease that out.
So some of that data was included in the presentation in terms of the percentage that is going to tuitioning, but we can certainly dive that out, break that out further, and we've broken it down by what setting, including the 4 traditional academies, the therapeutic schools, and other approved independent schools as well. So we did have that presentation in the data, but I know we didn't have a lot of advance notice to walk through it, and we can certainly dive deeper if there are questions.
Great, thank you.
Limiting tuition payments to average announced tuition. Anything to build on what was said on the previous item for that?
Well, I think there's a number of different carve-outs in statute that allow independent schools to set tuition or allow local voters to authorize higher amounts. And so I think just in terms of cost containment and downward pressure, we need to be ensuring that that applies to all actors within the K-12 system and not just the public ones.
But it would include public ones as well.
Public ones do have to abide by average announced tuition. It's the other independent entities that there are specific carve-outs that allow for costs beyond that. For example, if you operate a tech center or if your voters authorize a higher amount.
My understanding there's also one with a federal carve out. And so that's sort of an interesting piece of that puzzle that would need to be tackled, but we don't need to get into that now. Okay, establishing optimal class sizes, policy goals, other impacts. Anyone want to go deep on that one?
Well, I think part of the pieces we've heard of concerns are those smaller numbers. So I think it would be something, a tool that we could start to discuss to help hone that, and then hopefully encourage larger class sizes that don't exceed the maximum, but set some limits for those minimums. That could also potentially feed into that excess spending formula. So there's probably a lot of uses, but it's just a start of a conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Also to think about how optimum class sizes are achieved, and thinking about the opportunity to group multiple grade levels being a strategy as well.
Thank you. I want to do an awkward thing for this meeting, and well, we're running out of time, but for future meetings, we're going to be moving towards spaces that we are going to have more disagreements. And I would say there's an assumption that you agree unless you actually disagree. I want to sort of set that norm.
Okay.
So it is on people to open their mouths and say things if they have something they need to say. And everyone here is here representing a larger group of people. And so, you know, it is depersonalized, whatever it is that happens, and we will all appreciate that. Merging small schools and districts is sort of, you know, a next scale question from optimal class sizes. So policy goals are cost containment, economies of scale, quality of delivery, increased opportunity. One dynamic that I want to name for this one is that without, there's a political will challenge. And then the other one is that without other cost containment strategies, to some degree, history shows us that districts will sort of expand budgets to meet sort of the existing tax rate. So this is not a cost containment strategy without other strategies in place along with it. It could also incentivize the move to privatization.
Right, if the other sort of guardrails aren't put in.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we have a lot of experience with closure of schools in Vermont. We have the creation of larger governance structures, but that in and of itself was never intended to save money, right? School boards don't tend to cost money. it's the people and the facilities that they hire and oversee that cost money. So I'm not sure how many schools have closed and haven't moved to a tuitioning model in Vermont in the last 10 years. But I do think, you know, a lot of the feedback we've received as a state is we have very small schools and that is expensive. And
if I could I'm sorry. Just one point of research elsewhere in places that have closed schools, just to echo what was said, if there aren't other guardrails put in, there have been a lot of examples of which schools have been closed. And in order to essentially get the political will to close them, most of the elements that would have reduced spending were stripped away. So closing schools can save money, but in and of itself, they don't always. It's how you do it and what you do afterwards.
I think it's also closely relating collaboration amongst school districts. And even if you're not talking about necessarily closing a school, but incentivizing somehow the collaboration between multiple districts in a certain area geographically that can, you know, save on costs for transportation or child nutrition or whatever it is that the services that you're trying to save funding on.
I appreciated that comment, Elizabeth, because I think some of these conversations around how do we achieve scale, and there are different ways that that can be achieved. And, you know, closing schools is one option, but there are other schools in terms of thinking about collaboration at a larger scale and geography that could support that as well. And I think with all these conversations, we need to be really intentional about how we're measuring financial effectiveness and how we're measuring quality, because there's different ways to be able to operate in order to achieve those two goals. And I think we need to be really intentional as a state as we're setting those parameters.
I am not muted. I think it would be helpful to hear some examples of what that collaboration looks like, because I know that was part of our hope when we did the original merger bill. And so far, what I've been told is they're losing art teachers like crazy, because having to pack yourself up and move your project through 3 schools and essentially live out of your car is not an easy thing to do. And when you get a chance to have a room of your own, you take it. So I need some examples as to how that might work.
Thanks, Anne. And I in my own note taking, just want to say that I put that sort of very explicit need for collaboration among districts into the state supportive schools sort of section on the BOCES row to make sure that it was captured.
I think the hard part about the collaboration piece is in absence of a merger of some kind of governance structure, it becomes more difficult to collaborate with other districts just because the nuances of different master agreements between different school districts or things like that might cause an inability to collaborate as easily as if you all had the same type of policies and procedures and everything was in line. And that's why traditionally people lean towards the idea of merger in order to get all that governance structure in the same place so that you can collaborate. Could be even as simple as your schedules in your high school don't align. And so how do you collaborate on offering those classes together if your schedules don't align?
And your
those unaligned schedules
don't align.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Moving on to healthcare costs. We have reference-based healthcare, returning healthcare to local districts to bargain, and revising statewide bargaining. So on reference-based healthcare costs.
Can I just?
Yeah, go ahead, Nicole.
I'm not sure that's a short term. I reached out to Jeff Fannin about this because I was quite like VHI's already filed their rates for FY26. So
Yeah.
even if, by some miracle, all the hospitals in Vermont say yes, or the legislature over the objections of the hospital says this is what we're going to do, the timing of that program going into effect would not impact FY26.
Yeah.
So just want to clarify that even if the law went into effect July 1, the rates for VHI for next year have already been filed and will be likely approved by DFR this spring.
And I would say that in my filling out of this full table as a practice exercise, and I'd really like everyone on the committee to fill out, I'll send a spreadsheet version, not a PDF version, so you can fill it out for yourself. I'd really like everyone to do it independently. The date to curb costs is FY26 and beyond for almost all of them, like only 2 of them probably. In my filling out from my sort of policy assumptions. And so I think that's a really important part of us looking at this table and getting what we need from it in terms of our own planning work. That doesn't mean that legislation would not need to be passed this year to make a difference for the following year. We can't just keep on putting off the long-term reforms. But I just sort of want to name that. I think that's actually a great place to stop the conversation on this table. Like I said, I will send a blank spreadsheet to everyone for your own delightful homework purposes. I think the next time we see each other will be at the full commission meeting. And then we have another fiscal committee meeting after that. I'm increasingly feeling like the 3-hour time block is not actually enough to go deep on anything, and going to consider what a longer meeting would look and feel like, and would appreciate all of your feedback on that. Any other next steps before we adjourn from folks? Seeing none from anyone, I appreciate that. I see a member of the public's hands up, but we are not taking public comment at the end of our meetings, only at the beginning. And so I encourage you to send an email. I'm sorry about that. Really appreciate everyone's time today, and appreciate everyone being in touch if you have any feedback on this meeting or next steps for our next meeting. Thank you.
Thank you.